of votes. The international community is watching this very closely and will respond accordingly.
In other news, 2 children have been stabbed to death and 6 others critically injured in a stabbing rampage at a dance school in England. 11 kids aged between 6 and 10 were stabbed in the frenzied attack, with 2 of them dying at the scene.
It is understood that the children were attending a Taylor Swift event at a dance school when the offender, armed with a knife, walked into the premises and started to attack.
11 kids aged between 6 and 10 were stabbed in the frenzied attack, with 2 of them dying at the scene. 9
other children have been injured and 6 of them are in a critical condition.
2 adults were also critically wounded in the attack while trying to protect the children. A 17-year-old boy is accused of the horrific crime and was arrested at the scene. The motivation for the attack was not immediately known.
The investigation is in its early stages and the motivation for the incident remains unclear. However, Counter-Terrorism Police North West have offered their support to Merseyside Police as the full circumstances of what has happened are being established.
This has been Matt Boyland with your TNT News Brief. I'll be back with more at the top of the next hour.
This July, we're taking life seriously. Cardiac arrest is scary and more common than you might think. Did you know that every year nearly 9 million people will experience a cardiac event outside of hospital? Would you know what to do? I'm Australian actor Steve Bastoni, and I'm urging everyone to learn CPR as part of our Don't Die July campaign. Visit don'tdiejuly.com and sign up today, because you can't put a price on life.
If you've been told to pull up your socks, then make sure it's a pair of TNT socks. The TNT shop is now open at tntradio.live. From national security to global corruption, this is the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
And welcome to the Muckrakers with me, Basil Valentine, hosting today for the very first time, Tuesday the 30th of July. We're in the midst of a heat wave here in the UK, well into the 30s Celsius, up in the high 80s Fahrenheit. And you know what Noel Coward said, mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun. I'm delighted to say I'm joined today by my regular sparring partners, Andrew Eborn and Taylor Husak. And Andrew, it was a mad dog that was out in the midday sun recently, going berserk with a knife in Southport. An absolutely ghastly incident, motive as yet unknown. Taylor Swift, in whose name the class was being performed, I think people were doing dance and yoga to Taylor Swift songs, says she's in shock about this absolutely just tragic incident.
No, you're absolutely right, Basil. We're absolutely appalled by the utterly horrific incident to which occurred. And it's basically trying to unpack it at the moment. We've had Yvette Cooper coming up and sort of saying she's still trying to find out what's going on. All around the world, people have condemned this. It was indeed, as you say, a Taylor Swift-themed children's dance workshop, of all things, in Southport, Merseyside. 2 children are dead and 9 injured, including 6 critically. And 2 adults have also been critically injured, trying to protect the children. At the moment, people are all sort of speculating whether there's a 17-year-old boy from Lancashire was arrested on suspicion of murder and attempted murder. They're trying to get to the bottom of it. They instantly said it wasn't terror-related, but at the same time, they're still opening it up. Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, was being quizzed about that. How does she know it's not terror-related? And actually, she's sort of saying, well, in the last few minutes, well, nothing's been ruled out. The police are going to investigate, but they're not looking at anything else. What it does show, however, Basil and Taylor, is the terrible era that we're living in, where there is so much revolting stuff said online, which is now spilling out onto the streets. And I always make the point that we in the media have a responsibility to basically not inflame situations. And I've been on a number of shows fairly recently where they're all basically turned into clickbait. And it sounds as though people are there for likes, but people forget behind all that sort of stuff, there's a tragic life. And my heart goes out to the family and the community and everything else. It is absolutely appalling.
Yeah, I was up in that part of the country just the weekend, actually, in Liverpool. And Southport is the smart resort on the Fylde coast. It's Blackpool's posher brother. So I mean, it's absolutely abysmal that this happened there. People saw it as something from a horror film, and I'm inclined to wonder whether or not the endless gore that we see on our screens, I say I don't see it because I choose not to watch such things. But in popular culture these days, graphic violence is depicted in a way, that's far more realistic and frankly stomach-churning than it was 50 years ago. And I wonder if people become desensitized to what violence is really like, actually, Taylor.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point that you bring up. And I also would point to the overall mental health crisis that we are seeing in people who are being put on, say, antidepressants, who were also locked in their homes for a year and a half. And I think that we're seeing some of the effects of those policies. And then also, too, just the pharmaceutical industry. I know that's not the topic of the day today, but we have to ask questions. What is causing this? And like both of you, of course, my heart goes out to those who are impacted by this horrible violence. And it really does show that we are so divided within our own communities. And hopefully we can seek an end to this violence that does not lead to any draconian measures that take away the average person's, human rights and civil liberties. That's also an important component to this, to make sure that there's no overreach in that aspect as well.
Andrew, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think the whole point about being desensitized, we're given statistics about casualties in war, and we always say the first casualty in war is the truth, and people dispute the figures and so on and so forth. The result is this, and wherever there's a loss of life, it doesn't matter on which side, it is horrendous. And each of those people have families and friends and communities, all of which are behind them. So I think you're right. We mustn't lose sight of our humanity.
Yes, I mean, I've got serious issues with filmmakers and television program makers these days who want to depict extreme violence as somehow being normal, as being part of the ordinary run of events. Now, fortunately, most people's lives are not touched by tragedy in this way and not touched by violence. But if we look at some other parts of the world, a lot of people often wonder how Jair Bolsonaro was ever elected president of Brazil. Well, quite simply, he was elected on a law and order ticket. 48,000 people were murdered in Brazil the year that he was elected. So that's 1,000 murders every week. We're nowhere near that in UK, even as a proportion. We, of course, have a smaller population than Brazil. And I discovered from Charles Mallet when he was on Locked and Loaded last week that out of 6,500 firearms officers, police officers in the UK, in 2023, only 2 rounds were fired in situations where police officers felt they had to discharge their weapons. That's 2 shots, literally 2 bang, bang, from the guns of UK policemen in the whole of 2023. Now, if we contrast that with the United States, I mean, how many thousands of rounds were fired? How many thousands of people were killed by gunshot wounds? So, for all that some people say, oh, well, you have a disarmed population in the UK. It is only bladed instruments that are in general circulation among the public. And when disasters like this happen, it's just as well that it's only bladed instruments. It's very disappointing that they end up in the hands of lunatics like this, because whatever else you could say, to attack innocent children at a dance class, he must be mad on some level, criminally insane for sure. But this is just outright lunacy.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
Andrew.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Basil. And I think that is so important to emphasize. And the other thing to emphasize, which has become apparent when you're talking about the police, is that everybody jumped on, an unfortunate turn of phrase, but everybody absolutely was appalled by the early footage of a policeman kicking somebody in the head at a particular thing. And then a further video emerged trying to put the whole thing into context. And we always say there's this massive rush to get the news first. Things must be put into context. We have to turn down the narrative. And I would absolutely implore others in the media to basically don't just go for the clickbait, because it's such a poisonous environment at the moment. And by doing so, you're merely contributing to what's already a diseased information age.
A diseased information age, and I would even say to a certain extent a diseased culture, Andrew, because, as I say, of the normalization of violence. That's the thing that we've got to get away from, really, that violence is in any way, extreme violence like this is in any way sort of cool or even, dare I say, sexy, or makes the man involved look strong or powerful. We need to completely turn the page on that whole aspect of the zeitgeist, frankly, Taylor.
Yeah, I would agree. And going back to Andrew's point about people not jumping to conclusions based on a small amount of footage or just based on a one-sided story, I think that people's general distrust in the media is leading them to ask more questions when they do see some of these reports or videos initially coming out. Perhaps we're not as curious as we would want people to be, or as skeptical as we would want them to be, and they're seeking out additional information before making assessments on the information they receive. I do think having this healthy distrust of the media, of social media as well, and footage that you see is a good thing. So I think there is an opportunity to have some growing awareness about the fact that what you see is not always as it actually is in reality.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Now, when it comes to distrust of the media, that brings us on to our main topic of the day, which is the situation in the Middle East, where, of course, the corporate media have done everything they can to minimize the scale of the horror in Gaza, an absolute hell on earth. Just this morning, Al Jazeera reporting people returning to the city of Khan Yunis, which has been utterly devastated and is totally uninhabitable. Meanwhile, the prospects of a wider war involving Lebanon continue to bubble away in the background. And of course, Turkish President Recep Erdogan said at the weekend that he may be ready to invade Israel. I think that was hyperbole, but he made references to what Turkey had done in Libya and Syria and suggested that the same may happen to Israel. Meanwhile, Netanyahu, is he spoiling for a fight with Hezbollah, who was responsible for the death of the 12 Druze schoolboys on the football pitch? It's the worst situation in the Middle East that I can remember. And at the center of it all, we must not forget the overwhelming suffering of the Palestinian people, both in the West Bank and Gaza. Now, this is going to be quite a wide-ranging discussion. And I want to also bring in what Lord Soames, Nicholas Soames, grandson of Winston Churchill, said in the House of Lords towards the end of last week about the ICJ ruling on the occupation, confirming what we all already knew, which is that it is illegal under international law and that Israel must withdraw its entire presence from the West Bank. Finally, the double standards that apply to the so-called rules-based order are there for all to see, the Israel exception. And Soames made the point that if we allow Israel to make this exception, if the United States continues to allow Israel to make this exception, then the so-called international rules-based order is stone dead, and we are thereafter in the law of the jungle. We may be there already. Any number of points to pick up on there, Taylor, Andrew. Who wants to jump in first and get into the meat and potatoes of this abysmal situation?
Sure. Yeah, sure. I'll jump in here through a journalist perspective and media perspective, and I'll go back to sort of the beginning of this most recent escalation with the attack that occurred in Medal Shams. And this is, of course, in the Golan Heights region, which is occupied by Israel, and only the United States, it's the only country in the world, I believe, that recognizes this as being part of Israel. The rest of the world does not recognize it as being officially a part of Israel. And so this region, and we could get into the details about why it's of interest to occupying authorities, but there's a lot of tensions in this region. But going back to my other point about the media coverage of this, and that is that there was, in my opinion, I think, clear deception initially. So the reports that initially came out, and I think they came from the IDF, or at least the Israeli government, was that these 12 children that had passed away were Israeli children, which, let me just start by saying that it doesn't matter who passed away. The loss of life, no matter their origin, is tragic. It's devastating. However, Israel then went on to also state that this was a Hezbollah attack. However, people who were on the ground, eyewitness testimony states that this was coming from the Iron Dome in the area. So there has been some conflicting ideas about that exactly. And then once the names of these victims were released, they had Arabic names. They were clearly of Syrian origin. So it seemed that perhaps this was a mistake in the reporting, or there was an intentional emotional manipulation that was being pushed onto the public. So from a media perspective, I just wanted to point that out, as well as the fact that it doesn't make sense that Hezbollah would attack this region. This is a Syrian Druze community. There are not many left in this area. So strategically, it didn't make sense. And as I said, Hezbollah has denied their involvement in this initial attack. And then I did speak to some colleagues who are in Lebanon and stated that people in Lebanon all understand that Hezbollah was not behind this attack. But unfortunately, this has led to a further escalation, and many are now concerned that this could lead to an all-out war with Iran, which would be devastating to the overall region.
Andrew, it's a really very dark web, isn't it? Do you think Netanyahu would be so cynical as to send rockets to kill Arab children in the Golan Heights and blame it on Hezbollah in order to create a wider regional war and bring in the Americans? Surely he's not that mad.
Well, as I always say, it's important to question everything, and Taylor raises some very interesting points. And as people are jumping, is what we said at the beginning of the show, people are jumping to conclusions. And the initial reports are turning around and having to say, well, actually, they're not quite right. But to put it into context, I mean, the incident follows a pattern of low-scale conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, which have intensified since the Hamas-led attacks in southern Israel on October the 7th, and the appalling terrorist attacks then. And I think it's interesting that Hezbollah have denied it, and there's all sorts of evidence that that we should at least sort of look at that, because they do say that they acknowledge there was another attack not too far from there, which they accepted they did. So it's going to be all sorts of questions that need to be answered, and we need to sort of turn around and make sure that those questions are not just answered, but the answers are questioned.
We're going to take a short break now. When we come back, we'll be looking at the prospects for that long-awaited ceasefire. Will Kamala Harris make any difference? Is Joe Biden going to be gone before the end of the year? And would that make any difference? We'll be right back after this short break.
I didn't ask to be thrown in the streets with nowhere to go. I didn't think I'd survive. But I did ask for help, and Covenant House was there for me.
1 in 10 young adults will experience a form of homelessness this year. For these kids who didn't ask to be put in this unthinkable situation, Covenant House is there.
Covenant House helped me break the cycle of homelessness in my family. They gave me the love that I needed.
Over 2,000 young people will sleep safely in a Covenant House bed tonight. When youth who are experiencing homelessness have a hot meal, a safe place to sleep, medical care, and love, they can overcome heartbreaking challenges and have a brighter future.
They just really genuinely just wanted to help me succeed, and I'm succeeding. I'm a speaker, I'm an author. Covenant House really helped me and really helped mold me into the woman I am today.
If you or someone you love is asking for help, go to safeplacetosleep.org today.
A better business tip from TNT Radio. The benefits of advertising on today's news talk, TNT Radio, should be clear to businesses of any shape or size. It can be accessed anywhere, anytime, by anybody, and is the perfect way to build brand awareness and stimulate digital activity. If you'd like more information about advertising on TNT Radio, simply fill out your details on our contact page and we'll be in touch. To find out more, go to tntradio.live. This is the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
And welcome back to the Muckrakers today, Tuesday, the 30th of July. I'm Basil Valentine in the chair, somber mood today, the horrific incident up in Southport, of course, and possibly a wider war in the Middle East, but not according to US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. He has said that the United States does not believe a fight between Israel and Hezbollah is inevitable, and that Washington would like to see things resolved in a diplomatic fashion. Well, that makes a change, doesn't it, Taylor? Resolve things in a diplomatic fashion, if only the same could be said for all the conflict areas of the world.
Right, exactly. And again, I would point to what are the actions being taken by the U.S., by Israel, by the other parties involved, and what are they saying? I would put more weight into the actual behavior, the actions that they are taking. But just to build upon Andrew's previous point, it is true there has been a back and forth here. So Israel's claiming it's Hezbollah. Hezbollah is denying a responsibility for this attack. However, when the Israeli foreign minister had gone to the region of Madal Shams to attend the funerals of these children who had passed away, he was met with much hostility from the people there. And I think it's important to highlight that, just the sentiment, the perspective of those in the region. They feel that it was inappropriate for this individual to be there and other members of the Israeli government. And this was specifically Smotrich, the Israeli foreign defense minister. So I just wanted to add those additional viewpoints as well.
Andrew, the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has this morning called on Israel not to fall into the trap of retaliation, saying she's very, very worried by the situation in Lebanon and the risk of regional escalation. I've also heard reports this morning that Egypt is massing its forces near the Rafah crossing, and as well as militants in Iraq being mobilized. We need a rapid de-escalation, don't we? And the best thing that could bring that about would be a ceasefire in the central conflict in Gaza. Over to you, Andrew.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I raised this point on another program very recently on TNT. And I said, look, we're not trying to take either side. We're basically pro-peace. And what happened is somebody then used that little clip, a slight different thing, and we're calling all sort of it's anti-Semitic and you're basically an appeaser of Hamas and so on and so forth. And actually, it's such an abhorrent distortion of reality when anybody goes out and tries to find peace.
I'm very, very glad to hear you say that.
And so, yeah, go for it, Basil.
Well, I mean, you know, how many people have to die before the revenge lust that was unleashed on October the 8th is satisfied? Is there any limit to the killing and suffering of the Palestinian people? And also, once again, we cannot divorce what happened on October the 7th and thereafter from the context of the lust, frankly, getting on 400 years, certainly 80 years, which has been one of constant ethnic cleansing and a slow motion genocide. Let's just focus for a moment on the situation in Gaza itself. Palestinians are returning to Khan Yunis, describing it as an uninhabitable wasteland. And a World Health Organization spokesperson has told Al Jazeera that a ceasefire is needed in order to assure vaccines reach children, with Gaza's health ministry saying an immediate intervention is needed to prevent a polio epidemic. There are also skin diseases breaking out and, of course, the threat of mass starvation. There have also been children dying of heart attacks. Taylor, on the face of it, a World Health Organization intervention to provide polio vaccine sounds like a good thing, but they can't entirely be trusted, can they?
No, and I've seen this being reported, the threat of polio and other diseases in Gaza. And there was also another report that came out in The Guardian. I believe it was authored by Tedros himself, the head of the WHO, in which he stated that he is committed to sending 1 million polio vaccines to Gaza. This does raise concerns because if you look at the history of the WHO, they have a pretty checkered past. They had shipped vaccines to Africa, which included, one example is it included the HCG hormone, which then sterilized many women in Africa. That's without even looking into the COVID vaccines. I won't go there when I'm talking about this specific issue, but they have a checkered history. In addition to this situation that had taken place in Africa with the tetanus vaccines, there was also an incident. This was during the outbreak of the war in Syria, and it was reported on in around 2013, in which there was also a polio outbreak in Syria, and UNICEF partnered up with the WHO, made efforts to vaccinate all of the children there. And I just think that we need to be cautious about this. And then also, when you take a look at the broader threat of violence to these children, to the people in the region, that is a far greater threat than the risk of contracting polio, in my opinion. Of course, I am not a medical professional. I do want to highlight that. But I think that we need to be careful when welcoming the WHO into the situation here, because remember, the WHO is also in a major PR crisis, given its draconian handling of the so-called COVID-19 pandemic, its disastrous pandemic treaty and IHR amendments. So I do see this also as a way for this health organization, the WHO, to win over public favorability by offering help to Gaza, and we should all be skeptical about that. And also given, as I said, what they've done in Syria and Africa.
Skeptical, perhaps, but the UNRWA, the Relief and Works Agency, Britain has agreed to restore its funding to that in spite of those entirely unfounded allegations of involvement with the attacks of October the 7th. Of course, everybody stopped their funding on a dime, if you'll pardon the pun, and no links between the attacks of October the 7th and the UNRWA were ever established. Now, over in the States, of course, Kamala Harris is now the nominee. She faces a very, very difficult balancing act, Andrew. In Pennsylvania, for example, the No Ceasefire, No Vote campaign is gathering strength. Republicans, like the people who attacked you at the weekend, are desperate to paint any kind of move towards peace as somehow appeasing terrorists or even bizarrely anti-Semitic. It's a very difficult situation both for her and the Labour Party in Britain, which is also now finally pushing for a ceasefire, and which notably withdrew its objections to the ICC arrest warrants for Gallant and Yoav Gallant and Benjamin Netanyahu last week. So tectonic plates are in motion, shall we say, in diplomatic circles. And what Britain and America seem to forget as well is that the global south, the rest of the world, sees this whole conflict in very different terms.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Basil. And I think that this is what people have to do. You can't please everybody, and trying to get votes on the back of something which is abhorrent has got to be wrong. And we were talking about Viktor Orban recently. I mean, he was on his sort of peace mission beforehand, trying to meet everybody to try and see if there's a path to peace. And he was basically vilified, wasn't he, by the EU, and various members of the European Parliament were calling for Hungary's rights to be taken away from them and for Viktor Orban to be censored in some sort of way. And this is, we have to stop this narrative where anybody who's trying to find this road to peace is basically, as you say, called an anti-Semite or an appeasist of Hamas, because that's wrong. What we're trying to do, the way you get peace is to try and get people to sit down together. And people will then turn around and say, well, you can never negotiate with Hamas. They're going to turn around, and they've always vowed to say they're going to kill everybody until they've done that. Well, that's exactly the narrative that Netanyahu's saying, isn't he? He's not going to stop until all of Hamas are wiped out. So the reality is we need to sit down and encourage people to find a path to peace. It's not easy, but it doesn't help inflame the situation by using this vitriol and as I say, just trying to go for clickbait for the sake of likes and so on and so forth, which, as I say, I find absolutely abhorrent.
Well, absolutely. I mean, both in the Ukraine, if you say you want to talk to Putin, then